welcome to the ALS Podcast. Today in conversation with Patrick Großmann. Himself diagnosed with ALS, entrepreneur, journalist, and host of the podcast episodes. Open questions about ALS. In these episodes, he tackles questions he has received through email or social media, as well as questions that he personally has. These open questions about ALS are once again the central focus of today's ALS podcast. Dear Mr. Großmann, we warmly welcome you back to the show.
Hi, that too. But
Third episode in the format.
It's become pretty normal.
Completely normal. And I had already asked you last time, in the second episode, how you're doing personally in terms of your health and well-being. How is the situation from your perspective?
I would describe it as still stable. Clearly more limited when it comes to, so to speak, the legs. That wasn't really an issue for me before, but now it's reached the point where I can only walk short distances. Otherwise, thankfully, everything that's essential for life, like, as you hear, speech, swallowing, breathing, and so on, is not affected at all. So still great. Yes, there's progression, but it's happening at a much slower pace than before. And for now, that's pretty much where things stand, which is manageable and something I'm adjusting to.
Stable, exactly.
Although certainly everyone who is affected by it, especially when they reach the point where I currently stand, will at the very least notice just how vastly different the two perspectives can truly be. When someone mentions slow progression, and you yourself, in terms of autonomy, find that you're only drawing smaller and smaller circles each time. So things like hiking or, even really everyday stuff where you just realize, okay, it's not that dramatic for a doctor at this point. But for the person affected, of course, it's a tough pill to swallow. At times, it's about somehow keeping your focus intact and not letting yourself mentally break down. I think that's the biggest challenge, and it's absolutely crucial to keep that up and maintain it consistently.
There were a lot of questions now in the YouTube comment section about the topics, but there were also questions specifically about you personally, and that's why it's good for us to take a moment here and get a little update on how you're doing as well.
Exactly. I think it was also asked how old I was when I got the illness.
Yes, it's not up to me to answer that.
Exactly. I'm happy to answer if anyone's interested. So I was 52 at the time of diagnosis, and now I'm almost 55, right? Actually, almost 55, but I had already been experiencing symptoms a year or two before.
Yes, okay, so now we're diving into the open-ended questions here.
So I'd actually like to start off a bit again because, of course, many listeners, or what's most interesting for the community is obviously the studies, although that won't be the only field we'll discuss, but I think you can try to keep it brief and concise and maybe tackle a few things along the way here today that were actually addressed there. So, new year, new luck. I read an article in LIPCAL recently and was genuinely taken aback to discover that in 2025 alone, no fewer than 16 biotech companies are actively participating in the developments, actively engaged in the development of a drug-based ALS treatment worldwide. In short, which approaches do you personally see as being at the forefront? Like, where would you say the focus is right now?
Yeah, it's a bit speculative.
Might be.
Yes, that's speculative. Almost every company claims to be right on the verge of achieving it themselves. Personally, I find the approaches promising. Those that target a specific genetic factor. That's strategically the most promising at first, but the downside is the potential risk of unforeseen complications that could arise from such interventions. That it only affects a relatively small number of people.
At least initially.
At least in the initial phase, exactly. So, roughly speaking, 10-15% of all individuals where it's now confirmed they carry a mutation. That's the limitation. And apart from that, I find these approaches quite intriguing. Those that target the so-called molecular signature, namely TDP43 . And there are actually certain studies now, I believe.
We'll get to one for sure.
So I consider this relevant because, in principle, it's clear that 97% of all affected individuals have TDP43 deposits, and that's roughly as significant as it is in Alzheimer's drug development, which is now successfully underway, also began targeting those deposits approximately 15 years ago around that specific time frame. And the lead up there is a bit earlier or longer. And it now seems to be working effectively in targeting tau or APP directly. And there are now at least 2 medications in the Alzheimer's field, which aren't breakthroughs yet, but at least represent a significant step forward in that there are treatments available at all that target deposits. Зрение, которые получают утверждение.
So one of these studies, I believe, is the one I wanted to bring up, and it would be an approach that aims to actually directly target and intervene in the misfolding process of the TDP43 protein to actually prevent it from happening. There has already...
Which study?
This is about the study by Takeda. Exactly. So maybe I'll explain it briefly and clearly for better understanding.
Yeah.
They already, in 2023, so to speak, as part of this study, had a medication called AS202. And the actual manufacturer or study leader back then was AcuraStem. I believe they eventually went ahead and purchased it, right? Censored or cut out. Censorship, so...
Takeda took over the further development and then proceeded to license, or more specifically, to in-license the entire startup company.
Buying versus licensing. The difference?
Yeah, absolutely. Yes, it's not acquired. Rather, they received payment for it, which is several million, so millions. In my view, over $100 million. Wow. For over $100 million, Takeda acquired the rights to further develop and ultimately market the substance. And if it were successful, Takeda would still continue to pay. It's practically like some kind of lottery mechanism, if you will. Very unlikely that it would succeed, or even more improbable that it would actually manage to succeed at all.
It's worth it if it works.
That's the key principle here.
That's a medication or a study that kind of flew past me over the last 2 years. That's why I brought it up again now. I'm not sure how well known it is. What's the current situation and how do you feel about that approach?
Well, I haven't heard yet that it's actually advancing into clinical application, such as a phase 1 or 2 trial, just yet. But for now, the focus is primarily on data that's been developed through animal experiments and foundational scientific research investigations. From what I understand, it's based on that. So it's also an antisense oligonucleotide, even though it doesn't target a genetic factor. But antisense oligonucleotides can also target outside mechanisms. So it's an ASO, an antisense oligonucleotide, which specifically targets a mechanism that allows the cell, particularly the motor neuron in this case, to expel waste material out of the cell.
Where it won't interfere.
Where it's no longer a problem. This is called exocytosis. There's also endocytosis. It's like a shopping bag and a trash bag, and those are also like little sacks. The cell actively forms these pockets to import essential materials. That's the shopping bag. There are also pockets for things like TDP43 to dispose of later. And that's essentially a kind of garbage bag principle called exocytosis. And this antisense is specifically designed to enhance the process of exocytosis significantly.
Because that's the main issue, that we can't get rid of the waste.
Right. So it would be like now a bit, very much a metaphor here, but as if practically a medication ensures that more trash bags are brought into an apartment, which is in the process of becoming messy.
A good image actually for the cell.
Yes, so a messy cell that now essentially gets a recycling service provider to come in and thoroughly clean everything out completely.
But there weren't more approaches before. That was already quite unique, right?
Yeah, at least with this exocytosis. I'm hearing about it for the very first time right now, actually. So essentially an exocytosis molecule. That's what's innovative about it.
So basically with the study, you still need to wait a little while longer. It's still too early to make any claims because it's in the early stages. Yeah,
it's an early stage. Interesting concept, but not yet relevant in the sense of we're looking for affected individuals to participate in your study, not at that level yet.
Maybe a quick update on the QurAlis study. It's been asked quite a bit. Yes, QurAlis.
That's the one. It's still in phase 1, but it's gained momentum and is progressing forward again. And now it's the case that the first patient in Berlin, making it the second study center after Lübeck, which was the initial location, the working group led by Julian Grosskreutz has officially begun its work. And with QurAlis, it was like this. It's just the basic principle. Since it's such a very new drug, phase 1, there's still limited prior experience. So initially, only a smaller group of patients is treated with a specific dosage. Then you first check how are they doing anyway. And then comes the recruitment halt. That's why initially nothing happens. You genuinely want to ensure that. The first group, which is administered a low dose, thoroughly meets all the essential safety criteria required before proceeding further. And that's not a sign of chaos or anything like that, nor is it a lack of dedication or effort.
A sign of caution, right?
A sign of caution, absolutely.
Right, it's crucial.
Extremely important. Or of restraint, or what other explanatory patterns there might be for why things aren't progressing further.
That's perhaps also a general thing, I'd say, within the community at this moment. Of course, people naturally jump or would love to hop on every single train that passes by as a life model, because you're thinking, okay, I've got to do something. And we'll circle back to that topic a bit later on. But ultimately, it's not just about medication. It's also about consistently being mindful and cautious with yourself in every situation, and not just try everything recklessly. That's kind of my impression, that sometimes people really just go ahead and experiment or medicate wildly without much thought or caution. I think you're someone who tends to strongly urge caution there.
Absolutely, there must be a careful balance between benefit and risk, and between innovation, but also the potential risks involved. That has to be a solid balance. And yes, exactly. So with QurAlis, it's that the next recruitment wave has now officially started. The study advances further. It also targets TDP-43 implicitly.
Yep.
It actually falls under the TDP-43 relevant approaches.
You just mentioned Mr. Grosskreutz yourself. There seems to be another study which neither I nor the questioner were quite sure about what it's actually called. But there is also a study in Lübeck, which is supposedly already in phase 3, concerning a new medication. And it is expected to last another 52 weeks. I read something about it here. There was, I believe, a report on NDR or something along those lines. Yeah, that's the Quran. The whole thing with phase 3 probably just got mixed up somehow. That's the Quran. I've already cleared that up.
Yes, I think so. So that's clear. The NDR report, it was a bit over-communicated, I'd say, honestly. And it was essentially portrayed as a promising path toward discovering a potential cure in reality. Yes, exactly. And that was clearly exaggerated journalistically.
That's the persistent issue with my profession at times.
I think we've now fully cleared up the misunderstanding. It's identical. Julian Grosskreutz Lübeck is QurAlistic. Okay, good.
How are the Rozebalamin? I hope I pronounced it somewhat correctly. Study from Japan and the approval of the drug there to evaluate.
Here's a more complex term used to describe the substance, and that is methylcobalamin. And that is, to put it in very simple terms, essentially just vitamin B12. Yes, that's what's referred to as a megadose of vitamin B12. It implies that the substance is indeed available. And with that, I certainly don't want to encourage self-use. I think we've already talked about that at some point. But essentially, it's a megadose of vitamin B12.
What can one really say about it at this particular moment in time?
This is a study where I tend to be a bit more cautious in my overall assessment, namely DOT. Because we're dealing with a situation quite similar to edaravone. This pertains both to the substance's origin, Japan, and to the approach, specifically that it's categorized as a compound with strong antioxidant properties. It's about both oxygen radicals, which are derivatives of oxygen that can potentially be quite toxic.
That's where those people focus, like those who take CDL regularly.
For instance, that's the case.
That's actually not. Okay, antioxidative factors do indeed play a role in ALS.
Role play, yes.
So it's definitely a part of the entire discussion, I'd say.
Absolutely, absolutely. And the third parallel between edaravone and methylcobalamin is that the original clinical trial, which was carried out almost 10 years ago on a significant cohort of 400 ALS patients in Japan, ultimately demonstrated consistently negative results across all key endpoints evaluated.
Just as it was with edaravone, yes.
As with edaravone, a subgroup analysis was conducted. Also in the vitamin B12 study, the first one, which was negative. And they said, okay, yes, but here there's a group. If you now focus solely on analyzing those specific individuals who were affected for less than a year at the start of therapy, there's a noticeable signal indicating an improvement.
So it's an early stage treatment here.
Yes, an early treatment. Then a study was conducted specifically focusing on the early stage patients, which I believe is perfectly okay in terms of the approach taken. What can you do? What should you do? That's not the criticism. But here's the catch. The study only lasted 4 months. 4 months, yeah, but you can't really say anything definitive. At least not until 9 months have passed. Actually, it's more reliable after 12 months. Europeans say 12, while Americans once said 6, but backtracked after many studies failed. And now they're even suggesting 9 months. But the study wasn't 12 months, not 9 months. It was only 4 months in total duration. And supposedly, it delivered a positive signal. But when you take a closer look at the data, from my perspective, and that's where the real criticism comes from, the placebo group and the verum group, verum, which is the vitamin B12 group, wasn't truly balanced out. That means at the start of the therapy, the placebo group was already progressing faster in the ALS progression rate with a point loss of 1 per month. And the verum group only lost 0.2 points per month. So my criticism stems from 2 reasons. First, the study groups were not properly balanced at all. And second, it was only 4 months, which is far too short a period. So from a medical and scientific standpoint, I'd not recommend megadose vitamin B12 administered through intramuscular injection, the method used.
Because it's something you could do without a prescription. Exactly. I think it's really important to emphasize that point.
It's an extremely potent substance, and the dose is so substantial that it must be administered intramuscularly, meaning injected with a needle into the muscle. Take it once every week.
Could do it alone, but need the doctor who...
Intramuscular injections are absolutely not something you should ever attempt to do on your own.
As I said, spending time in those forums reveals just how desperate some people are. To wrap this up regarding the studies, unless you have some particularly specific input, of course, it's always something that viewers frequently ask about. Whether after the unsuccessful studies, there's anything new available on C9orf72,
gene variant, or if there's at least some development happening there, well, there's an interesting observation and an ongoing study that's currently being conducted in Florida. Zrenia, and it originates from an observation in an experiment, not yet on a human level. The data is now being paralleled. With a first human application, and this exclusively concerns individuals who carry the C9orf72 mutations, who are currently undergoing treatment with the anti-diabetic medication known as Metformin.
An anti-diabetic medication? Yes, that's precisely the situation here.
So an anti-diabetic medication, and it traces back to an animal experiment where researchers administered this drug to mice, which also had a C9orf72 expansion to study and closely analyze its potential effects, discovered for specific mechanistic reasons and administered it, and found that metformin significantly influences the formation of these unwanted proteins, which emerge from the reading frame. And I'll take a moment to explain this process in a bit more detail shortly, just for clarity. The C9orf72 expansion, that the proteins are reduced. So with the C9 mutation, a so-called repeat expansion occurs. That means it's like a kind of stuttering or repetition within the genetic code sequence itself. And that is practically a new DNA sequence that forms. And this new DNA sequence also results in the creation of a completely different protein than the one originally encoded in the genetic material. In a sense, C9 produces a protein, but within that same protein, additional new protein is also formed.
Durch diese Expansion, durch diese
replication. And it's highly probable that this additional protein being produced is indeed toxic to the cells. And metformin, this anti-diabetic medication, has demonstrated, at least in animal experiments, that the production of this undesirable protein is notably decreased over time.
You have to come up with that idea first, right? I mean, an entirely different medication. Did you even look into that at all?
It's about the mechanism of how these proteins are formed. This wasn't just random chance. Instead, they observed which specific molecules and enzymes are involved, and then conducted a thorough and detailed database query which approved medication targets it. And there are very extensive databases available, and that's where bioinformatics plays a crucial role and becomes extremely helpful. In the end, they essentially arrived at metformin as the most suitable option based on the analysis. Now it's even harder. Of 10, 9, 11, or 72 mutation carriers, are they taking the medication, yes or no? The answer is probably better not. Not yet. And because of those anti-diabetic medications,
Cause severe side effects.
Have very serious side effects. Through an overdose, that's really, really dangerous. Up to a comatose side effect. Not to discourage it entirely, but
I'll come back to that in a moment, especially because it's always a question with these off-label issues and so on.
yes, but C9, if you're asking about that, it's something entirely new, and we will definitely follow up on that closely. And we are preparing an individual treatment attempt or individual treatment attempts with this medication.
Exciting. And that will probably be shared via the...
Well, it will involve those affected themselves. For now, this primarily concerns only the ALS Center at Charité. We're currently preparing the formal aspects of this individual treatment attempt. That's also easier said than done. The State Office for Health and Social Affairs. It's the Ethics Committee, not the so-called Ethics Commission. The commission is in charge of clinical trials. Charité's committee handles individual treatment cases and preparing corresponding documents and so on. So that's what's new. And then there are several startup companies in the US, especially those that are still targeting C9UF on a genetic level.
That's also the most frequent gene variant. Yeah, around 7 to 8%
of affected.
I'd like to circle back to that topic because we were just discussing the USA and earlier mentioned this gene variant, this medication, which wasn't originally designed or intended for everyone in the first place. There are indeed in the USA and other countries. On multiple levels, medications that ALS patients or those with other medical conditions can regularly access, which, however, are not yet approved in Europe. A patient is inquiring whether Charité would be willing to issue prescriptions for such medications, even within the framework of an off-label use model, so that they could be privately obtained through organizations like, for example, Everyone. And here it's specifically referring to the drug ibudilast.
Ibudilast. Very cautious, so essentially. The same story as we with self-administration, and we would always tend to lean more toward, if anything, an individualized experimental treatment approach. The individualized approach has the benefit period that no costs are involved, or that, of course, there are costs involved, but the costs are not borne by the affected individuals. And of course, you can't do that for everything, but it ensures that the outcomes of compatibility, now we're circling back to the crucial issue of safety, are properly addressed. Then truly remain with that specific party, whether it's the Charité, Unibon, Ulm, Lübeck, or others like them, those who are conducting the individual trial.
So it also has to do with the fact that the results will benefit others as well.
Absolutely. It's about taking responsibility for the benefits, but also for the potential drawbacks. Then the fact that economic aspects don't come into play is also fundamentally essential. So right now, it's not just about issuing a private prescription that goes through an international pharmacy or an organization. They're also operating in Holland, and it's far from free. But I'm genuinely having a lot of issues with that. Issuing a private prescription means someone else is stuck with tens of thousands of euros. And then it's absorbed somewhere in the area, nobody monitors or checks what actually ends up coming out of it, because the responsibility for the outcome isn't really in our hands at all.
Just patients.
But when it comes to managing patients in this specific case, that's where I truly have the most difficulty. Yes, there are undoubtedly controversial opinions on this matter. My stance, I can imagine that, but it's absolutely crucial to maintain a clear line, even in such a complex field. And the so-called responsible party, as to who is responsible, is clearly defined. And that's the case with preparation prescriptions that pharmacists offer internationally, not so well resolved. And in the case of an individual treatment attempt, another party comes into play, namely an ethics committee, and also points out to one party, there are several people involved who are dealing with it. Is it actually justified? Is the balancing of interests acceptable? Are the patient rights, which are the core of this issue, already presented in a balanced manner within the patient information? Are the risks, are they genuinely and accurately described within the text itself? And so on and so forth indeed. So these are all factors that play a role. And the likelihood to now get very specific about ibudilast, that the substance is helpful, I personally don't consider it to be particularly high or convincing at all, to be quite honest, because the substance has been under discussion for 15 years, and for 15 years. Affected individuals, particularly in the USA, but also across Europe, have been conducting their own trials with this medication.
Another affected individual was prescribed a low dose of naltrexone, 4.5 milligrams, by a physician friend. Naltrexone is a medication typically used to treat alcohol and opioid dependence, as far as I know. Recommended. This doctor who suggested it actually prescribes it herself for autoimmune conditions such as multiple sclerosis, Crohn's disease. He's asking whether you specifically have heard of it in this context and if you'd personally recommend it.
Yes, naltrexone is actually an older pharmaceutical agent and mainly interacts with the opioid receptor system, and therefore also withdrawal from alcohol, as well as other addictive substances. But with the opioid receptors, there are also significant connections to processes of immunomodulation and immune regulation. And that's also where the application for Crohn's disease comes in, which is essentially an autoimmune disorder. And with ALS, it's a bit of a stretch. There's a hypothesis suggesting that immune factors could play a role. But the immunological approaches tested so far haven't been successful. Neither cortisone therapy nor even chemotherapy worked. You really have to use more specific immunomodulatory mechanisms. So these general immunosuppressive concepts, like those currently being discussed regarding opioid receptors, I consider them less likely to be effective, that it works. You really have to get to such specific approaches, like in the ABCD study, where specifically autoantibody reducing cells are suppressed, so the CD20 cells. So B cells that are currently producing autoantibodies. That's the concept of the ABC study. When you pursue such approaches, it makes sense. But these general immunosuppressive concepts, cortisone, whole body radiation, all that was done, I'd place it more in that direction. Not due to study skepticism, which I genuinely don't have at all, to be honest. Skeptical of naltrexone, more from a mechanistic standpoint.
On the topic of drug studies, there's also this somewhat critical observation from a commentator at the end. He mentions that he's gradually growing increasingly tired of hearing about it repeatedly and questions when they'll finally begin investigating the root cause of the disease. What would you say to him in reply? I mean, they're also actively searching for potential triggers. It's not as though they aren't looking for triggers, right?
Yes, I can absolutely understand that there's frustration or almost a sense of demoralization, that for years and years it keeps being talked about studies, and yet so little actually seems to come out of it in the end. You know what I mean? And that is unfortunately, the fundamental principle of experiments. And I'd also like to use the term study interchangeably with experiment. Most experiments indeed turn out negative. I can understand that, and the frustration is primarily physical for those affected because, after all, they are the ones directly impacted.
Time's running out, exactly.
Aber the disappointment lies on the side of all those involved. And essentially, when a study team works on a study for years, it's also their own lifetime.
Yeah.
And in a way, the clock is ticking there too, just differently. South. This kind of disappointment. It's present on both sides only. I want to say something positive. We've never been as close to having more studies that truly dig into the root cause of the issue as we are right now, at this very moment.
But doesn't he have a point somewhere? Is the complexity not indeed too little captured within the scope of anamnesis and patient questioning? So, particularly this trigger issue, yes, one always had the feeling it somehow naturally goes. But it is too little questioned on the patient level. I think, how does the person actually live? What is he doing? What has he done? What might he have eaten? I have no clue. There's already that zone that somehow isn't really...
Okay, that falls under the trigger to understand. For me, the trigger is TDP43.
Yes, you're now approaching it in a very medical way.
Yes, okay. That required a lot of research.
Mainly sporadic form.
Yes, okay. Maybe I can answer that better then. So there has been a lot of research in this field, and there's even a study that's currently being conducted in Munich and is still ongoing. It's specifically focusing on that again. It's called EARLY-ALS, with 2 registry studies. One is called TUALS. It's centered on identifying a potential biomarker in the tear fluid, and without blood and without DNA or anything else, in a straightforward and easily accessible manner. That's EARLY-ALS. That's one study from Paul Lingo's team. But the other one, which is perhaps a bit undercommunicated, is called EARLY-ALS, and it's only about the early signs. So if someone says nothing is being done, I wouldn't entirely agree with that. There's a lot to this topic, and there's been much to it in the past as well, truly speaking now. To identify clusters, there are specific patterns: athletic behavior, unwanted weight loss, desired weight loss, and certain professions involved.
Well, it's now increasingly assumed that it's likely the interplay of several factors or triggers, I'd say, that leads to the onset of the disease. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I think there's also a kind of step-by-step model now where they say, okay, if someone doesn't have a genetic predisposition, it's somehow 5 factors that need to align. I'm not sure who did it, probably the USA. But with the genetic form, it just requires a small nudge, something along 2 levels or so to get it moving.
Yes, exactly. The question is absolutely valid. It relates to this concept of the second hit or multiple hits, meaning that several different blows are required. One alone is not enough. And the second one perhaps isn't either, but the third or fourth blow, that's what then leads to the... If we knew more about that...
Then that, of course, means one could potentially take preventive measures much earlier on.
Absolutely, yes. But I must say, in the past, over the last few decades, there have been several of these epidemiological studies. But they also didn't result in much more than frustration. And naturally, it was discovered that it's primarily individuals with an above-average income who are most significantly and consistently affected by this issue overall. And it's primarily individuals with a lower BMI. It's also those with higher levels of education who tend to be most significantly impacted by this issue. And it's people who were already a bit thinner beforehand. But the conclusion after all these years of research was, and now what's the next step forward? So, and what comes next? Bringing it all together. So the TDP43, with the realization that it's individuals who have achieved a higher level of education. The ends couldn't be brought together, and that's something that will eventually be discovered and understood one day. So basically, we have a puzzle now, and here lies one piece called education, another called BMI, and the third piece is the rest. Stress. Another piece is TDP43, and the final piece is C9. So, but how does that all come together? And that has essentially not been achieved yet. And at the moment, I fear that even if we discover another risk factor, such as increased exposure to zinc, it still might not fully explain the issue. Charité just issued a statement. A new manuscript on this topic is out now, with a slight but statistically relevant increased exposure to zinc. So what conclusions can we actually draw from that data right now? So the question isn't does it exist, but what's its relevance?
And how do we ensure that it doesn't spiral into a panic-driven frenzy, leaving everyone thinking, oh my God, it's the zinc. It's not just the zinc.
But the fundamental concept, which the person who asked is referring to, I absolutely agree, is indeed correct. That it's not solely genetics and not solely environmental factors, but rather the combination of both elements working together. But I must admit, the connection between these two ends is still not yet established.
Are there specific studies on the topic of trauma, such as PTSD, for example, and ALS?
Yes, it does lean in that direction. A particularly notable French study thoroughly examined this specific connection, which I reviewed. I'm not certain if it's been published yet, as it was only a few months back. There were, again, soldiers examined. This time it was about French troops, and previously in the published data it was about Americans.
There are indeed many veterans, absolutely.
Correct. And it also raises the question of whether trauma, even psychological trauma, so psychological issues, stressful situations, it kind of leads to the question of post-traumatic stress disorders. So whether psychological and or physical trauma, maybe even already in childhood. Well, I haven't heard anything about that yet, but whether it will initially contribute to an increase in NFL levels and whether there's a potential risk for developing ALS is certainly being discussed.
In Switzerland, there is an ALS registry. In Germany, we don't have something like that yet, I believe. Wouldn't that be a good idea to get more precise numbers, especially regarding prevalence and epidemiology? Yes.
That is.
So wouldn't that actually be a great idea to perhaps explore a way to capture data differently in that direction?
Yes, the answer is yes, it already exists, and yes, it makes sense. Well, unfortunately, it's not available nationwide. But it is. In Swabia. Oh, here we have the so-called Swabian Registry. And that's thanks to Professor Ludolf, who is now retired, but who many years ago, I'd estimate it was roughly about 15 years ago, initiated it. And this registry is still being continued. Professor Dr. Angela Rosenbaum now heads it up. Indeed.
Still not nationwide yet.
Yes, that's just how it naturally is, I suppose.
What's the issue?
Financially, purely financially. That was supported back then by the German Research Foundation. That's perfectly sensible to have that nationwide. But at least this question that has been raised here in the chat or in the email correspondence. Incidence prevalence is clarified if we assume that the Swabians are not fundamentally different from the other individuals within our entire population as a whole group. Then we can quite well adopt these data on incidence and prevalence across the board.
So we can extrapolate and project.
There are also data on survival. And there is a very good collaboration with the registry offices. And then the causes of death are recorded by the local clinics. And that has the advantage in principle because it's a somewhat rural region, as the population is more centralized and easier to track. The obligation of hospitals, when they first make a diagnosis in neurology, to then forward this diagnostic code G12.2. ALS to the Central Study Registry is definitely greater than in an urban setting, where such processes might be less strictly enforced, where perhaps the responsibility isn't as clearly defined and so on. So in that respect, I would really emphasize once more positively that we've managed to also have a population-based registry in Germany, although unfortunately not for the whole of Germany.
Small shift in topic. This May, a symposium will be taking place in Washington, during which a Dr. Bedlack, whom we briefly touched upon earlier, provided information on the topic of ALS reversals. That's kind of his pet project. This means more specifically that as part of a study, it's being investigated why there's a very, very small subset of patients where the symptoms either appear to stagnate, though not truly stagnate, but are actually even starting to demonstrate signs of regression again. Do you find this aspect intriguing, and could you perhaps elaborate a bit further on it, including what this underlying study specifically entails?
Yes, overall, it's really interesting.
So the guy kind of looks like a rock star, at least at first glance.
He shows up for the day because he dresses almost naked every day. And there's this really famous Instagram account of his, Rick Bedlack. Exactly. Or his full name is actually Richard, the longer version. But his topic is highly serious, centered around meaningful and impactful content. Highly serious is a very serious individual with his own life philosophy and so forth, deeply thoughtful. But you really have to separate it now, his demeanor, and from the things that he actually does. And what he does is a very, very interesting topic, because even with HIV or oncological conditions, there's so much valuable insight you can learn and gain from them. Patients whose courses differ significantly.
So those who don't fit the standard pattern, but where something unusual or unique is happening.
Yes, exactly. He has been working on it for over 15 years now, and there was already a publication more than a decade ago in the journal Neurology, where data from the PROACT database were analyzed and presented, which is indeed a large database that aggregates study data, including survival data and progressions and so on, all traceable in relation to the ALS function rating scale. And there he found, and I think the numbers are a bit exaggerated, but back then 1% of the entire database, which are reversals, and reversals, as the term suggests, refer to cases where the disease progression has been reversed.
There are clear criteria for that.
Yeah.
It's not wishy-washy. I believe it was clearly defined what counts as a reversal.
Yeah.
From my perspective, those were patients who, over 12 months, if I'm not mistaken, but I can't fully commit to that now, though.
Mhm.
It was definitely at least 12 months, clearly. Then showed an improvement in the ALS functional rating scale of around 4 points, roughly speaking. So I can't be pinned down on the exact numbers right now, but at least the criterion was a time criterion, which was quite long. And the other criterion is also highly valid. Or the ALS functional rating scale is highly established. He identified a significant portion of patients that, firstly, don't worsen, which he referred to as a plateau. And then, when patients actually show a significant degree of improvement, he categorized that as a reversal. And yes, well, I think that might be slightly exaggerated in the PROACT database. Not entirely representative of the overall cohort, since it's strictly confined to the study period itself. And this study database was solely supplied by the pharmaceutical industry. And at some point, the pharmaceutical industry discontinues the observation. Once the study ends, they pull out entirely. They lack a longer-term or ethics vote. So these are essentially truncated data sets. And if you're no longer observing the further progression, it might appear as a reversal. That's why I consider this figure of 1% to be exaggerated. I mean, I've been dealing with this disease for 30 years.
But I think what you're really aiming for now in this study or in your research is to find out what unites these people, right?
Absolutely. That's the fascinating part. First, the share might actually be higher. I wanted to come back to the 30 years. I don't want to put myself in the spotlight, but I still want to say I consider this to be a super, super, super rare event. And some events ultimately turned out to be misdiagnoses on my part. Exactly.
It might be a misdiagnosis.
Absolutely. And I don't know how thoroughly those misdiagnoses were then reviewed. You can't always deduce that from the database, not even from myself. Personally, misdiagnoses. Or, for example, a very interesting situation now. With COVID-19, we also had, for instance, a patient. It was a male individual dealing with the appearance of a motor neuron disease, also with a relatively rapid progression in connection with COVID-19. And then this illness truly came to a halt and eventually turned into a full reversal. Absolutely. That means it's a unique experience, but super, super, super rare, where I know it's a parainfectious encephalomyelitis, so an inflammation of the brain and spinal cord affecting motor functions, which wasn't detected in the spinal fluid. So that kind of thing can occur. But I would, and Rick Bedlack would, classify it as reversible instead. I'd view it as less frequent, more critical.
Ich würde sagen, als
You've got to distinguish a bit. But now comes the crucial part, which is also of great importance for the entire community as a whole. Namely, he has, within a dedicated working group, the genetic profile of these individuals who either have a plateau or who are reversed.
I've read about that. It's actually a completely different genetic defect.
Yes. So she discovered that all those who are reversed have an overrepresentation of a specific genetic variant, which in turn is closely linked to a growth factor that was actually brought up, discussed, and debated extensively in various scientific research circles several years ago. It was called insulin-like growth factor, IGF ... And this gene plays a crucial role in regulating the production of this growth factor. And when a specific genetic variant is involved, it leads to the growth factor becoming biologically unrestricted and significantly more active. That means it can more effectively stimulate the motor neurons to grow, which is particularly advantageous in a degenerative disease like this. What's interesting is that it's not just about saying, okay, these are reversals, and what can we do with them now? But taking the second step, figuring out what therapeutic potential it has. That's the difference from the epidemiological studies we discussed, where you say, okay, interesting observation, but what can I do with it? Rick Bedlack has now established this connection, at least genetically, and has clearly stated, yes, there's a trail here definitely worth investigating further. A trail leading to this genetic variant, potentially even activated in all patients. That's the intriguing part here.
That's one thing. The other aspect involves some vitamin-related investigations he conducted where he discovered that at least a certain deficiency wasn't present in them. Essentially, many of these reversals didn't seem to have a vitamin D deficiency, which is an interesting observation to note, for instance. Or perhaps a variety of other vitamins had also been supplemented by themselves independently. That's what I discovered. So that's a different matter. And what also seems to be extremely important for him is, above all, the factor of hope at this point. That strikes me as a bit esoteric, perhaps, but it could very well be the case. The body inherently possesses its own healing powers, or does it lean in another direction? So this hope thing is somehow really massive for him right now.
Even with his approach, I would still make some clear distinctions. South. For instance, I'd refine the definition of reversals to make it a bit more precise and detailed. Without questioning the concept of reversals, but just approaching it with a slightly more critical and nuanced perspective overall. And the same goes for the factors. So there, I think, the genetic factors, they are then just more clearly definable, scientifically graspable, and also easily verifiable by an external party in a straightforward and objective manner. He didn't do it all by himself, but rather involved a genetic team, and suddenly he and his opinion were out of the picture because it transformed into actual, rigorous scientific work to conduct these association studies. And well, I believe that it has also been demonstrated in other studies that psychological factors play a crucial role. However, I'm not convinced that a single factor alone can fully explain it.
An attitude alone can change an illness. I don't believe that's the case either, not entirely on its own, really.
That's where I see the distinction. And I do believe, and there is data on this as well, for example, studies on spirituality, which have shown that people with, it doesn't even have to be religiosity, even spirituality at all, experienced a more favorable course of illness overall, compared to those who are less spiritually inclined.
A mindset is something you have control over. You can, to a certain extent, depending on how you're wired.
It doesn't depend on that. Not everyone has access to the social resources or perhaps even the cognitive abilities required. You shouldn't do that now. Maybe not always assume from your own perspective, but you have to. Start from the weaker part of society. Not every individual who practices self-reflection necessarily intends to develop a spiritual framework. But in any case, I think the principle of hope, even if you're completely into this topic right now, is, from my perspective, a bit over-communicated in the sense that it can produce a reversal. the course of the illness changes already. Reversal.
Yeah.
I'm very skeptical about that. And what I believe is crucial when it comes to the topic of hope is, of course, the acceptance, or lack thereof, or the embracing of treatment options. And these are in turn relevant for survival. So it does make a difference whether I approach the illness with high morale, because I simply have that mindset or the resources or the environment and say, all right, fine, the cough assist device. 3 times a day, I'll get some help with that, so I'll definitely use it. Orient. The nutritional drink, okay, maybe it doesn't taste amazing, but I want to experience it and all that, so I'll take it now too, because I lost 10 kilos before. So I've got a cough assistant with the drink already. So, and then also the electric wheelchair with a standing function. All right, I'll definitely take that one. So, and there I am standing again for 30 minutes a day. And the ventilation, the hip support is also better. Mm-hmm. So we've got coughing, nutrition, and breathing, though you wouldn't immediately realize. It's about breathing when you're in a wheelchair. So this translation of implicit factors into perhaps life-extending elements through posture and hope, that's where hope truly begins to play its part.
Quality of life, perhaps, as well. You could certainly say that. It's all interconnected.
Yeah, well, Rick Bedlack might perhaps say that it's an expression of spirituality or of hope. I'd say there's something to it, but this mindset ultimately leads to very practical outcomes.
Adjustments that you then choose to make it better. Yes, I'd like to circle back to the topic of nutrition a bit later on in our conversation for more detailed discussion. We missed that last time, but I think it's crucial. Mm-hmm. What would be the approach concerning, for now, focusing primarily on vitamin-based supplements and similar products? What would be your personal advice? What? Daily dosage, or can that even be said, of any supplements is also a recurring question in the community. Is it even recommended? Or isn't that highly dependent on the status quo of each patient? Shouldn't one first perhaps take the time to carefully evaluate and truly understand where that particular individual stands before even considering starting to supplement with anything at all?
There is no supplement recommendation in that sense. Because even with large amounts of data, especially now from patients like me over 15 years, it's been running since 2006, where supplements were specifically analyzed. They didn't show a distinct pattern. That was essentially the aim of PLM. And PLM, by the way, also even played a motivating role for Ambulance Partner, who subsequently turned their attention to other matters. But in terms of the approach, specifically getting patients onto a platform themselves, with Ambulance Partner, it's now more about the function rating scale, weight charts, and all sorts of things. But patients like me aimed to figure that out and ultimately managed to successfully achieve it.
So they essentially surveyed the patients and closely examined what they were actually doing. And they entered it in the same way as we do our ratings. That was actually my next question. It would make sense, wouldn't it?
Absolutely. Already done.
It's already been done, okay.
Primarily, they also entered their FRS, functional rating scale, but they also essentially indicated, well, when exactly did I take the glutathione, actually?
Yeah.
Orient, everything, essentially, dosage, timing, their image also included, and giving stars and all sorts of things. So this work has already been done, and the result is that I now, basically according to these, are now almost 20 years. And I was actually there in person in Boston when the Haywood brothers first initiated the whole thing. So there's no result in the sense that it could produce vitamin E. No, vitamin E, 1,000 units a day. Glutathione or vitamin D, which is also a big topic right now. You can't really say that. But we essentially fall back to what's mentioned in the podcast, in the catalog. The Catabolism podcast already touched on that. Initially, it's about calories and fat, and then it transitions to supplements. When it comes to supplements, no clear pattern was actually identified.
Nutrition isn't exactly the same as supplements, but the two are somewhat connected and can influence each other in various significant ways. That's definitely a topic that the audience is really passionate about.
It's truly crucial. Yeah.
Exactly. But ultimately, as you just mentioned, with ALS, it's always crucial to focus on maintaining weight and avoiding any loss at all possible costs entirely.
Yeah,
that you should, so to speak, eat high-calorie, high-fat foods.
Yeah.
And I kind of have the feeling arises that the rest sort of gets brushed under the table. Does a diet that is particularly high in fats genuinely lead to a significant reduction in the NFL value within the human body over time? Or does it simply just make you not lose weight as quickly?
That was indeed the outcome of the LIPCAL I study. It demonstrated that in the overall patient group, survival wasn't improved by a high-calorie, fat-rich dietary regimen. And the NFL value also didn't decrease significantly. But in the subgroup with rapid progression, it showed a difference. NFL levels decreased significantly, survival rates improved notably. That's exactly why LIPCAL II was created. The answer is yes, potentially. But the entire cohort, that simply wasn't providing useful data. That's why there's a second study, this time with NFL DOT. We'll have clarity after LIPCAL II. And yeah, well, I hope it is, because that would have significant implications, particularly for the broader context. For further management, it could potentially mean that a high-calorie therapy might actually be recommended for individuals without any weight-related issues in ALICE if it is inherently neuroprotective. And there are already other indications that if the SOD mouse, which carries a specific genetic mutation, if that is indeed the very first instance observed in this particular context, before it even develops paresis, loses brown fat. That's how it is. This is the information that comes directly from the animal experiments. It is a metabolic disease, and it affected, since animals can be analyzed in even greater detail and precision regarding body composition, primarily fat is lost, which is why there's such a strong focus on fat and why it keeps being emphasized repeatedly in discussions. And I can understand the criticism. Why can't we focus on other things? But we're just glad to have an anchor point to start with. So the animal model, then LIPCAL I. And then the major French epidemiological studies that have shown people with hypercholesterolemia, which every internist strongly advises against, have a better prognosis. And people with hypertriglyceridemia, which means too many other fats, not cholesterol, but other fats, blood fats, also have a better prognosis. So that's where it comes from.
Wouldn't a ketogenic diet or fasting mimicking be considered in that context?
It's actually being studied in Ulm as well.
Makes sense. Is there anything there yet?
That is the PEGASUS study, that's what it's called. And it's a single-center study.
So just briefly on the background, keto diet. It's even said to help reduce oxidative stress levels significantly. Well, there are a few other factors that come into play, like minimizing inflammation and so on.
Yes, there's a colleague, Christine Herrmann, a young neurologist in Ulm, who specifically focuses on the topic of ketogenic nutrition. Right now, it's monocentric, if the results are positive. Then there will most certainly be a multi-center study initiated and carried out.
It's surely more something that's in the early stages.
The early stages of the illness that it's advisable, because it's not yet such an issue that you'd lose, because essentially you're consuming fat, but you're losing weight. So a ketogenic diet is also something that people do who are overweight, right? That's why it also has to be conducted within a study framework, because this study also has the potential for negative outcomes. Exactly. And that's why you have to be careful. But it is a controlled study, and also with side effect documentation and so on and so forth.
Progress is happening here.
It is being done, yes. So that would be interesting, perhaps also for future open questions. We are open to incorporating new questions in this area.
Yes, always. We depend on it.
To specify that, because I can now understand that there's an interest, and that even in the ALS clinics, there is a certain level of engagement. A daily topic, so to consistently keep nutrition at the very forefront. At the moment, the focus is on increasing calorie intake, or at least ensuring there are enough, while also aiming for a diet that's as high in fat as possible. Not because of a lack of creativity, but because of the evidence from this data. And for this entire vitamin topic, particularly vitamin E, it simply hasn't demonstrated success in past research studies that were carried out. And for vitamin D, from my perspective, there isn't specifically a targeted study yet. However, at least so far, there's no clear signal emerging from the major databases available.
I'm going to take this a step further real quick. There's a patient who wants to know, and I'm in the same boat. I used to do fasting cycles back in the day, really just for detox purposes, whether that might not even be a relevant topic, especially in the early stages of the illness, and whether it might not be intriguing to launch some interdisciplinary research, perhaps even at the Charité itself. She specifically mentions the framework of Professor Michelson, who I'm not familiar with at the moment. Never heard of him. You too? Interesting.
All right, we're currently at 24,000 of them here.
So your initial thought was, if ALS is caused by misfolded proteins that disrupt the expression of a protein meant to capture and neutralize free radicals, then perhaps targeting, then fasting, and the process of autophagy might be a truly worthwhile approach to consider.
So there are two considerations here. The first is that the misfolding of TDP43, several years before the onset of the disease, is already taking place.
Oh.
And with this proposal, there is now a conflict of goals involved. And this is roughly the conflict of goals that the internists also have. And they have articulated it in a very succinct way. The internists say, and unfortunately, we as ALS neurologists must also emphasize, you need to maintain a slim figure to avoid falling ill.
But when you're sick, you shouldn't really be slim. You need to be sick then, not too thin, exactly.
So there's the conflict of goals. I could easily imagine conducting a detailed study involving a specific diet or what's referred to here as fasting, especially when you're not in a state of illness. But I have great difficulty implementing a depletion of energy, meaning a withdrawal of energy, especially when more is actually required. And that would be something like saying DOT in internal medicine, where similar things exist if someone has HIV, to do a fasting cure there. And it's just as harmful there. Orient, perhaps even more strikingly, the example of heart failure. You have to maintain a slim physique to avoid developing heart failure. But if you do have heart failure, despite the stroke volume that needs to supply the entire body, it's still more beneficial to carry some extra weight and remain corpulent.
I didn't know that one.
Yes, absolutely, always better. Higher BMI, better survival at the Charité Heart Center. So that means DOT. There's the conflict of interest. It's not skepticism per se, which kind of subtly comes through with the questions being asked. I can understand that. But I really just want to bring it to light. It's more this conflict of interest that exists to know, okay, this is very wasteful with energy.
But it's absolutely vital that you reiterate that point, because it often resonates the notion that, okay, the pharmaceutical industry, the doctors are ultimately only driven by what they control lingers in the background, even if it's rarely ever directly spoken. That's why I said it here, but it's fine.
Yes, so there are these two issues. One is ALS. The misconduct begins 10 years before the onset of the illness. That's the one issue. And the second issue is when you're in this tough situation, this metabolically challenging situation, the system switches to catabolism. There's this consequence I'd just like to mention again for the second time from Johannes Dorst South, the ALS-affected body shifts to catabolism, meaning energy burning, and unwanted, highly undesirable. Starting a diet in that context or conducting such a study, you must implement strict safety measures.
Enforce.
From my perspective, the likelihood of this not ending well is pretty significantly high indeed.
Personally, I tend to drink too little rather than too much. I've got an app now and I'm trying to increase it a bit. Is a rather moderate fluid intake for the eggs.
As long as there's also a bit of alcohol in there, a touch of colorin in there, that would be perfectly fine with me.
But currently, there's also no evidence that drinking too little water is harmful. I'm familiar with that. Should we still cover the brief topic of physiotherapy, or do we want to postpone it?
I'm afraid. We've gone a bit over time now. I believe we'll save that for episode 4. Today, we're on the third episode, and that's also the perfect moment to express my gratitude for all the effort you've put into preparing this one. It's truly a lot of work.
But it's a lot of fun. It's also deeply personally driven, and that makes it truly enjoyable.
If it's fun for you, I think that's really great.
All right.
Well, I thank you at this point for preparing and moderating this episode, and I thank you, dear listeners, for your continued interest in this new installment of Open Questions on ALS, and for your commitment to subscribing and supporting the ALS podcast. With my warmest regards and appreciation.